Where is the greatest Jets team of the 2.0 era now? Let's check in on some of the great standouts and forgotten players from one of the most fun Winnipeg teams we've ever seen.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight, I am continuing our series of the Where Are They At Now, checking in on former Winnipeg Jets that have departed the team and perhaps moved on to greener or not-so-greener pastures. And tonight's episode is finally coming up on my personal favorite Jets team that I've ever watched. You don't even need me to tell you which one it is. Of this 2.0 franchise era, there is only one team that I think truly lives in the minds of every single person who is a Jets fan, and that is the 17-18 team. This squad was the one that I truly thought was going to win the cup. Last year's team, I thought had an all right enough chance, but that team, the 17-18 team, I fully believed from the bottom of my soul that they were going to win the cup. So when they didn't, that one really broke my heart. It felt like that was Winnipeg's destiny. But even still, what a great ride it was, what a lot of fun. And, it does kind of make you reflect on how good that team was and something about how the Jets need to get back there one day. And that's why I want to close out today's episode also talking a little bit about this year really needing to be the year that the youth finally truly step up and seize roles. Because based on how this offseason has gone, there's not really any other help coming. So let's chat about the past first, right? Before we do, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, like I said, let's start off with the 2017-2018 forwards, and you already know a lot of the top ones. Let's talk about some of the guys who maybe have fallen a little bit off the radar or were at one point really big Jets players and guys that people loved, but either moved on or in some cases even returned later. That guy that I'm actually kind of referring to is Paul Stastny, and we all remember Stastny as the secret weapon in Winnipeg's arsenal. When you talk about looking for a second-line center, there was no other player that really came to mind quite like our guy Stastny. Paul, behind Scheifele, was really the secret sauce to Winnipeg center depth that year. He was an unbelievable force of nature. And, ever since then, I think the Jets have really been looking for somebody like him. We haven't really been able to replace him. And even still, it's been a bit of a struggle without a player of his caliber at 2C. His Jets tenure was freaking awesome. He had one of the best power play bumpers on the team. And, that stretch that he had running into the playoffs when he was acquired in the 17-18 season was just unbelievable, man. He only played about, 36 games. And in that stretch, he had, 28 points and was very clearly one of the best forwards on the team. And then, of course, after that, he went to Vegas for a couple of years, got himself some good hardware, and then came back to Winnipeg after that. The second couple of seasons with the Jets were, pretty decent. He was starting to slow down, but still could put up some pretty decent numbers. But of course, this was around the time of COVID, so it was a little bit of a weird time for everyone. And not long after that, he moved to Carolina for the last season of his career, and then hung it up. Man, Stastny had already at this point, been into his 30s, and so he'd been around long enough to even play overseas in a lockout. So, yeah, Stastny'd been around for a while, heck of a career, and, we'll always remember having had one of the most fun deadline trade acquisition stories in Jets history. The dude came in completely by surprise. I think that was the year that the Jets were trying to get Brassard, if I recall correctly. Vegas went for Brassard instead, and Winnipeg got Stastny as a result, sneaking in at the 11th hour. So what a cool moment that was. Really wish he'd been able to win a cup with the Jets in that season. Next guy that you're maybe going to remember just a little bit, if nothing else for the fact that he would scrap a bit, and really from his dad's days, it's Brendan Lemieux. And Lemieux is actually still playing, not in North America, mind you. He's moved overseas, but even still for like the past 5 or 6 years, he's been either with LA or with New York. He did have a couple of stops elsewhere, including a brief stint with the Flyers and then some time with the Canes, which is a little bit interesting that he ended up with Carolina. I can't say that I would have expected that. But since he departed the Jets in 1819, he's bounced around quite a few different organizations. And I think it kind of speaks to the fact that people kept thinking that they could turn him into a more useful fourth liner. And I think the biggest thing that Brendan brought was physical toughness, fighting, and sort of a bite. You look at his penalty minutes, and the dude could absolutely rack him up, even if the points production wasn't necessarily there. Nowadays, he is in Switzerland. He has moved to Davos, which is pretty interesting. Davos is a cool place if you've ever seen their arena. That has to be pretty dreamlike to play out there. And if he, starts to wind down his hockey career pretty soon, I'm sure that he'll have some good choices to maybe swap to a few other European destinations as he, sort of closes it down, right? He was never the guy who was going to score lots of points and stuff, but he did enough to certainly carve out a role throughout his career. Another guy that, I think we all sort of remember as being an interesting trade deadline acquisition was, well, not really trade deadline acquisition. He was a free agent signing. It's Matt Hendricks. And Hendricks came in and, played the role of 4C. At this point, when he joined the Jets, I think a lot of us had mixed feelings, right? He wasn't really the kind of guy that you would expect Winnipeg to bring in and really play a pivotal role. But he did enough, right? He was your fourth line guy. He ate up games during the regular season, and he brought veteran leadership. There was a version of Hendricks many years before that was actually very good. It's a shame that we didn't get to see that one from his prime Caps days, but, he still had a few decent moves. We didn't really get to see the Paralyzer in the shootout, unfortunately. And, not long after he left the Jets in 2018-19, he went to Minnesota for a little bit and then hung the skates up. So, at this point, he was already into his late 30s, so good to see him, get some time off. He's been spending time with family. I know that. And we always enjoy seeing that. Last guy that we're going to talk about from that team, Jack Roslovic. You probably remember him as sort of the player that almost was, but didn't quite make it for Winnipeg and ended up wanting to leave. Since his departure from the Jets in 1920, he's been carving out a very successful career with both the Blue Jackets and the Hurricanes. He's currently a free agent as far as I know. I don't think he's signed yet, but somebody will pluck him, I'm sure. He's a very solid middle six scorer. There was at one point a rumor that he might actually be willing to return to the Jets. I don't know that ever came to anything. If it did happen, it would certainly be interesting, is how I would describe it. Coming back with Arneal, maybe it could work out. I don't know. It always felt like he was sort of the one that could have been for the Jets, but just wasn't. Never quite put it together in the way that I think a lot of us were hoping for, but he was still a very good player, and he showed it after he left the Jets. So if he does return, that would certainly be intriguing for some of the scoring depth issues that Winnipeg currently has. But, we'll have to see how that all pans out. Now, I've spoken at length about the forwards. I also wanted to spend some time talking about maybe some of the defenders that you've perhaps forgotten about or have tried to forget about. We'll chat about some of the Jets' former blue liners coming right up. College football is back, and honestly, there's nothing better than the energy of tailgates and being in the stands with your fellow fans. The only problem, though? Ticket queues, and we all know that they absolutely suck. Having to get hit with hidden fees and prices jumping at checkout after you just waited hours in line for a ticket really isn't much fun. That's why I use Gametime, the app that gives the advantage back to fans. It's the easiest way to score last-minute tickets at the best prices with no surprise fees. What you see is what you pay, and you always get a best price guarantee. I've used Gametime when I was buying Ravens playoff tickets a while back. Super fast delivery, very convenient. All of the fees were upfront, no hidden charges. I even got a seat view and panoramic perspective from where I was sitting in the stadium. It couldn't have been easier. So take the guesswork out of buying college football tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Gametime today. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about some of the forgotten and now departed Jets 2017-2018 defenders. We talked a little bit about forwards like Lemieux and, of course, Hendricks, and now it's time to look at the back end. Now, a couple of these guys, actually, most of them are actually still playing in the NHL, just with different organizations. One of those guys happens to be a multi-cup winner now, if you can believe it. Dmitry Kulikov, really one of the most interesting Jets defenders that I've seen in some time, because I think in a lot of ways he was maligned in a lot of areas, and I don't think he was actually as bad as people made him out to be. He certainly didn't play a pretty game, and it was never glamorous or sexy, but Kulikov actually defended pretty well. He was hard-nosed, hard-tack sort of physical player, did tend to take a few extra penalties, more than you'd probably want, and there were certainly limitations to his game. But as far as like a solid, middle pairing kind of guy, or even third pairing defender, he did a good job for the Jets and spent, a few years there before moving on to quite a few different organizations after that. He was everywhere from the Devils to the Oilers. He had stints in Minnesota, Anaheim, Pittsburgh, and he has seemingly found a real home back with Maurice in Florida. He's been doing really well there. Actually, he had played with the Panthers many, many years before, and so this was kind of a return back home of a sort, and also reuniting with Paul Maurice, probably something that he was excited about. Maurice tended to give him quite a bit of ice time. They seemed to get along pretty well, and Kulikov was a very solid player. I tend to think he was a little bit unfairly viewed, and especially with a lot of the third pairing guys that we now have, not so great. He also got along pretty well with Scheifele, so nice to see him do well. And he's now a 2-time Stanley Cup winner. So how freaking about that? When you think about him bouncing around between like 5 different orgs and getting 2 cup rings at the end of all of that, that has to feel pretty great. Still a Warrior, still ticking along. Hope that he continues to have a solid career. The next 2 guys, maybe not as happy for Jets fans in some ways. Jacob Trouba is currently an Anaheim Duck. He spent many years with the Rangers, and his departure actually helped the Jets bring in a pretty massive trade haul. They did well with some of the picks after that. And in New York, Trouba's career really started to nosedive. It was already kind of trending a little bit downward before he left the Jets. And then, with the Rangers, things just really started to fall apart. There were questions about his leadership, about his on-ice performance, and things just didn't really go very well. He certainly played a fair few games for them, but there were times where he was one of the worst defenders on the ice. And so this is just one of those times where he really needed to get out of New York. The situation was becoming toxic. The reason that he left to even come back to the U.S. was to support his wife. And so all respect for that. Just a real shame that, it didn't really work out with the Jets at the end. And, it does kind of feel like the Jets dodged a bit of a bullet at the end of his tenure in 18-19 because there were signs that things were starting to slow down for him. And it just seems like it really hasn't gotten better. With the Ducks, there were some signs that you could resurrect his career, and he looked pretty all right with a very bad team behind him. He's never going to be a top pairing defender, but one day it'd be fun if ever he would be willing to come back on a cheaper deal. I think he could actually be a pretty serviceable second or third pairing guy. But of course, that's just sort of getting the gang back together for the vibes, not so much the on-ice performance at this point, right? You're not really expecting him to be the top pairing guy that he once was. But he's made quite a bit of cash. He's had a pretty good tenure with the Rangers, at least on paper. Just a shame that so many things kind of disintegrated around him at that moment. We also have Tyler Myers, and Myers hasn't quite had nearly as much chaos in his career since then. He has been playing all of his time out of Winnipeg with the Canucks, and again, he's been doing, Tyler Myers things, which is being big, occasionally scoring some pretty goals here and there, and also having those moments in defense where maybe you'd want somebody else manning that position. But he has, I don't know, he's had pretty impressive longevity for a guy who, for many of the early years of his career, suffered from some really big injury concerns and actually, had some shortened seasons where things weren't always going according to plan. But, with the Jets, he had a couple of solid seasons really in the first couple of years that he was with Winnipeg. And then things kind of got a little bit chaotic towards the end of his tenure. Left, the Jets after the 18-19 season and moved to Vancouver, where he's really been a fixture on their blue line, although whether you think that's a positive thing or not, who's to say? But, he's been there for a while. He's been doing some solid work. And so always good to see. I'm always going to root for like former Jets to get paid. I don't care if, they're great or terrible on the ice. I always root for them to settle up, get some good family time, and make some money, right? You always want them to be successful when they move on. Maybe not so successful when they're playing against the Jets, but hopefully, as long as they're not playing Winnipeg, I really have no qualms and hope that they continue to do well. There's very few players where I would have an exception to that rule, and they would have to have done something pretty heinous for me to not really be rooting for them to do well elsewhere. Now, the last guy, and this one's going to be a fun one. This is the guy that I think a lot of people really didn't care for. He was the subject of many wars on Twitter. Everyone used to debate about him. I used to pick fights with people on Twitter about this guy. Sami Niku, man. Sami Niku, gosh, your thought about Niku was always going to be a bit of a litmus test for how you saw defenders, right? Especially young prospects. And Sami, he was very talented. He was always a long shot. He was like, a 6th or 7th round pick. He was taken very late in the draft, and he was never supposed to be a top end prospect, but there were a lot of physical and technical skills that he had exhibited in Liga and in the Finnish junior systems that led you to believe that there was something there. And his first year or so with the Moose really made you think that he was going to be a stud player. And then things kind of just went off the rails in Winnipeg's org. Niku really didn't play much for the Jets, although he actually did play more games than I remember. He amassed about, I don't know, in total, maybe half a season to almost 2/3 of a season with Winnipeg. And then after departing Winnipeg in 2020, 2021, moved to the Canadiens for the 21-22 season, only played a few games for them, spent most of his time in Laval. And since then, at that point, his North American tenure was just not really going anywhere. And so he moved back home to JYP, and he's been playing mostly in Liga for the past couple of years. Just recently, though, he went to the Swiss League last year and has split time now between Cloton, and this year he's with Lausanne. So, man, you look at his points totals, and he's really been doing well overseas. I still feel like there's a version of him that could have been a really solid North American pro. It's a shame that it just never really came together. And I feel like players of his ilk often kind of get sent back overseas. You look at Brandstrom, a smooth skating, really offensively minded blue liner who didn't really stick with Vegas or anywhere else. Niku, it was a little more raw, if we're being honest. He had some real, let's say, lapses defensively, but had he had a different development track, I sort of wonder what his career might have been for Winnipeg. So we'll never really know, but there was at least some intriguing stuff there that maybe if he had been under a different coaching regimen, maybe a different developmental staff, maybe things would have gone differently. But it is what it is. Water under the bridge. He went back home, had a pretty successful run the past few years, and is getting to be a little closer to home, even if he's still in Switzerland. So all the best to Niku. Hope that he's doing well. And, hopefully we don't see the same thing happen with Heinola. Ville obviously has kind of been riding a lot of pine Still has this last year of contract control left, but at this point, I just don't really see a role for him with the Jets. So we'll have to see what happens in camp. Maybe something surprising happens. Maybe Aaron Neal does something really out of character, but I will say right off the bat, I doubt it. I think we probably have another Niku situation. So always a fun time, right? Trying to figure out who's actually going to make the cut. Speaking of youth and having an impact, I wanted to chat about this year really needing to be the one where the youth step up, because based on the summer, I don't think we have help coming in. We'll chat about why coming right up. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for rejoining us as we are just chatting a little bit about the past. We reflected on the 17-18 squad, and towards the end there, I talked a little bit about getting back towards what made that 17-18 team really special. And part of it was actually that you had ELCs helping out with a good core. Now, Winnipeg's core already is not the same as it was back then. I would say the Jets' forward depth is a lot weaker than it was. And that's just partly from age. And, this offseason has kind of been, if we're being honest, a little bit brutal. This was not the summer that I thought you'd follow a President's Trophy season with, but it does feel like maybe Winnipeg understands that the market's shifting. Maybe their own assessment of this team's competitive state is not quite on the same page with their messaging, because it feels like they have sort of made this upcoming year a bit of a write-off. Now, I'm not saying that they're not going to try to compete and that they're not going to do anything. I just feel like they're looking at this as a transition/retooling season where they'll try and push if it looks like they're in a good playoff spot. But if not, they're not really going to be upset about maybe moving some of these new contracts that they just signed. I'm specifically talking about the one-year deals. We're not moving Pionk or anything like crazy like that. But yeah, I look at this Winnipeg team, and it does feel like there's real opportunity for camp competition. Now, I know that goes against everything the Jets have ever done before. I'm going to see comments about it immediately. I think Winnipeg is going to be forced to call upon the youth sooner than later. For one thing, we don't even know what Taves is like, right? 2 years off the ice following long COVID, we have no idea what his game's going to be like. Lowry appears to be back in practice, but he might still take some real time to rehab. So we were already down Ehlers, and, we lost Appleton. You brought in some reinforcements and replacements, but I don't think anyone's looking at Nyquist or Pearson or any of those folks as being like high-end replacements. They are essentially stopgaps for your roster. They've got pro veteran experience. They can help the kids along. And it does sort of feel like this season is the transition year that I thought last year was going to be. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a big surprise somewhere. The Jets could absolutely do something crazy, but this feels more than ever like it's time for one or two of the prospects to really step up and force their way into the lineup. I don't know that it's going to be any more than two at most, but there, I think, will be some opportunity for competition. I'm primarily looking right now at Chibrikov and Lambert. I think those are the two guys that are really knocking on spots. More so Chibrikov than Lambert. Lambert will need to have a more impressive camp, and I'm not 100% sold on him just yet. Privately and personally, I still think he's a great prospect, and I think he does have real NHL skill. I just don't know if it's going to show up with the Jets work, right? That's kind of where I'm still sitting. But Chibrikov looked like a really solid middle six guy. I could see him immediately carving out an NHL role this year. He will have to work on the defensive lapses, but that's okay. That's part of his game, and he's still growing and developing. Elsewhere, though, you do wonder about players like Yeager and Salamonson. For me, they're another 2 to 3 years out, but I think at least one of these guys will get some time this year. Salamonson, I think, internally is viewed very highly by the org. There aren't many prospects in their system that I would say are untouchable, but Salo seems to be one that they just refuse to link anyone to. They seem to think he's the guy to be DeMello's successor. And based on how he's been deployed with the Moose and sort of the lack of any sort of trade rumors about him being sent away for rentals, I think really speaks to how highly the Jets covet him. Lambert, not given the same protection at all, not given the same status. He's apparently been on the block and was offered as part of a rental deal. So I think that there's a very clear pecking order, and a guy like Salomonson's near the top. Yeager, I think, has really moved his way into that conversation too. Braden last year in camp looked really mature, and I think this year he's going to be a very late cut. I think he's going to do enough to where the Jets look at him as really being pro ready. And, even if he spends the whole year with the Moose this season, I don't think it's going to be very long before he gets NHL time. I really feel like it's within the next 2 years, if not the season, getting his debut. Next year, I could really see him forcing a spot. And maybe that's why the Jets have done all of the stopgap stuff. They're really waiting for this youth wave to hit because they know that you can't just sign or trade for all these guys. You've got to start developing stuff internally. And I think that, some of their drafting selections show that. I do think that they've tried to improve there. I think that they've looked at more NHL quality and translatable skills that they've drafted. And so hopefully, at least a couple of these guys pan out. I'm not sitting here saying that the next Scheifele or Ehlers or Connor is sitting in our prospect pool. That'd be really ambitious. But I do think you've got Lowry's. I think you've got Niederreiters. I think you have players of those tiers that could help fill out the depth until you can figure out a more longer-term plan for the elite talent. The Jets may not be able to get that, but I still believe you have enough pieces as it is with the world's best goalie backing you up and a pretty strong team defensive structure to where I think there is a way to win by committee. It's hard. It really hasn't been done before. Only teams with elite talent have generally been winning recently, but Winnipeg has elite talent in other positions, just not the ones that you traditionally win with. So it's going to be a very interesting season, man. I'm kind of looking forward to it to see what happens with this youth group, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that a lot of them will play, but it does feel like this is the season for somebody to step up and be a hero. You've got an aging veteran roster that didn't really do a lot this offseason to fix a lot of the departures. Now it's time to call upon your ranks. You've been developing a lot of these prospects. You seem to believe in them because you won't trade them in exchange for big rentals. Now it's time to give them a platform to show if they can truly hack it. This is going to be a crazy year. I think we're going to see some big surprises from the Jets, maybe good or bad, who knows. But, in some ways, I'm a little more excited coming into the start of this season than I was last year. Obviously, last year ended beautifully and we all loved it. But I think this year, the uncertainty around a lot of things also breeds opportunity. And that's where I think the Jets can really start to improve themselves for the long term. But curious to know how you feel about this. Express your skepticism or optimism or even your passiveness in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Also, feel free to drop ratings for this off season and give your commentary. I might talk about that on an episode later this week because I feel like my own personal assessment has not been that positive, but maybe you see it differently. Let me know. But for tonight's episode, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here later this week, so have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.